So in this presentation, I'm going to be talking about solar bicycle touring, and largely in the context of the Suntrip solar e-bike race. So to start off, the big question, well, what on earth is a solar e-bike? It is more or less, as its name implies, it's an electric bicycle where the power is being harvested from solar energy. Now, in any electric bicycle, you still need a battery pack on the bike as a buffer. You wouldn't typically have solar electricity going straight into the motor. And the idea with the solar bike is that you decouple your energy requirements from the need to charge up at outlets along the way. So the idea is to try to bring with you enough solar panel that you're able to get inbound energy charging the battery both while you're riding and almost equally importantly while you're stopped having lunch breaks or setting up tent and whatnot. And the idea of solar e-bikes has been around as long as e-bikes have been around. And when we first got in this business almost 16 or 17 years ago, we had a lot of customers ask us, hey, can I put solar panels on my bike? Surely I'd be able to just charge my batteries automatically. And back in those days, I would always poo-poo the idea because knowing how much power you need to move a bike, which is about 500 watts, and knowing the size of a typical solar panel that you might fit on a bicycle, which is around 50 watts, the two things just didn't add up. You would need so much solar panel area to actually propel the bike, it would seem unfeasible. But as time's gone on, the efficiency and price of solar panels has gotten better and better. And then I've come to a bit more of a realization or appreciation on the needs of biking, which is that you don't have to have the solar panel always putting out enough energy to move the bike. You just need to harvest over the course of the day, the entire day, the amount of energy you need for your commuting portion of the day, which might only be 4 or 6 hours if you're bike touring. And when you look at it in that context and with the modern state of solar panels, it actually becomes quite an attractive idea for collecting energy while you're riding your e-bike and have a lower reliance on finding battery charging options along the route. So at its core, if you take almost any normal electric bicycle with the battery pack, you can add a solar panel and what's called a solar charge controller that can properly charge the battery at the optimum rate, harvesting as much energy as this panel can get you. So that at its core is a solar e-bike. Now the Suntrip is an event that started in Europe in 2013, and it was started by a French fellow who had a bit of crazy promotional idea to run a solar bike race from France to Kazakhstan. And he got sponsorship from somebody in the Kazakh government to promote this as an event, and managed to get, I think it was 2 or 3 dozen teams for the world's first ever solar bike challenge. And so the goal here was I think it was around 6,000 kilometers. There was no defined route, but there were some defined rules. So they didn't want you ever charging from the grid. They really wanted all the solar energy to be coming from sunshine. People were allowed to bring a charger with them only as an emergency, and they had it in a sealed box. So if you ever used that charger, you had to cut open the box, and then you were sort of disqualified from making it to the standings. And they also wanted to limit the capacity of the battery so that you couldn't have an enormous battery that would just get you through several days of cloudy, rainy weather in a row. The limit's around 1 kilowatt hour, which is about twice the size of your average e-bike battery pack. And so those were the main constraints. Otherwise, you left on one date and you had to arrive at a destination. And obviously the person who got there first won the race. But it wasn't much of a race in much of a competitive sense, but more an opportunity for people to go on a wild experimental adventure, both in terms of the science of e-bikes and the types of places and terrains that people can take them on. So this event's been going on and off every year or every other year, and in 2018 they decided to seriously expand the scope of it and do a 12,000 kilometer trip from Lyon, France to Guangzhou in China, following what they're calling the New Silk Roads. So the Silk Road is a famous trade route throughout much of the last millennium for the travel of goods across the continent. And China's actively promoting a more modern trade route with rail and truck transport. Lyon, France was a famous center for trade and for the silk industry, actually, and it's also where my partner's family is from. And Guangzhou, China is a place in China that I frequent often enough in the e-bike business. That's where a lot of the electronics and the battery packs are assembled and made. So it seemed neat to tie those two locations together and go on quite the ride. And at this point, I'd been running a business for many years without taking any long breaks or doing any significant adventure of my own. So this seemed like I'd been sort of nagging or itching to go on a tour like this. So we signed up rather last minute to join this race. And I was going to do it with my partner. and we wanted to do a tandem vehicle, but I was very drawn by the idea of a back-to-back tandem bike. So instead of both riders facing forwards, one's facing back, the other's facing forwards, and the thought on this is that your heads would be in close proximity, which would make communicating and talking while you're riding much more doable. One of the challenges riding on a bike touring trip is just that the sound, the ambient sound of traffic and of noise makes it hard to just chit-chat and enjoy the camaraderie of your fellow traveler. And it was also interesting to me because it gives you a 360-degree view of your surroundings. So one person's facing forwards, one person's facing back. Between the two of you, you cover all bases. And you can see the reactions of people who you're passing. You can wave at the cars that are trailing you, filming you on their camera. And I was also really drawn with the idea of exploring rowing bicycles. So on previous bike touring trips, you're just pedaling and it's entirely your legs doing all the exercise. And you miss the opportunity of getting a bit of an upper body workout and of just balancing the load profile, the sort of joints that you're wearing out. And I also had a strong personal interest in going on rowing trips up and down the BC coast. So me and my partner had built a 2-person rowboat, and we've sort of been longing to go on multi-day boating adventures on that. And we thought, well, this would be a great opportunity to help get ourselves in physical shape so that later in the summer we might be able to go on some more significant trips, on coastal trips on the water. So what I wanted was a tandem bike where one person pedaled and the other person rowed, and where we could switch up who was rowing and who was pedaling as the trip went on in order to both get the advantage of mixing up the exercise routine. So for the next 20 minutes, we're going to show you a short video that summarizes both the building of this vehicle and our experience participating in the Suntrip race. There were about 40 teams in total that signed up. About 20 of them made it all the way to China, which was quite remarkable given the conditions and the conditions of some of the bikes when they made it to the end. Unfortunately, we had to cut the trip short because we had an engagement midway through that we had to come back to Vancouver for, and you'll see the story told here. And then afterwards, I'll have a sort of a synopsis of some of the conclusions and the lessons that we learned from our experience on this trip, and then open it up to a Q&A session if you guys have any questions for us about touring with solar assist on an electric bicycle. All right, well, thank you guys for watching that. I'd also like to actually publicly thank Ali, who's in the audience here. Ali was the one who was able to make the whole Iran portion of our Suntrip possible, so we're ever grateful for him helping to coordinate that. Ali is also in the business of electric bike conversions like us and has a booth just down the way here. So that summarizes in as much as we could do in 18 minutes a snapshot of what a Suntrip solar bike tour would be like. We didn't set out, I guess we set out with the idea of filming bits of it and having video blogs and things. More or less gave up halfway through on any hope of that, but luckily had just enough footage that Aaron, our videographer here, was able to compile a fairly watchable summary of the adventure. So what I'm going to do now is return back to the slideshow and just discuss some of the sort of post-trip analysis and conclusions that we've had, and some of the sort of unexpected things that we learned from doing this, and share a few insights in case it's crossing your minds to build up a solar bike. So the first thing, concluding on this trip, not just our own revelation, we thought our bike was holding up beautifully. We did all of our own engineering, welding and fabrication. We kept hearing there was a group chat, a WeChat of all the different participants, and everyone kept having mechanical failures. Some people's frames broke right in half. People's solar roofs were falling off. A lot of roadside repairs. A lot of emergency trips to Polish welding shops. It was only after we started to disassemble the trike in Iran that we noticed that our main roof supports for the entire trike were cracked on all three sides. There was just a single edge of aluminum keeping that roof intact. I don't think we had another 100 to 200 kilometers before that would have just collapsed on us while we were riding. And you think, oh yeah, well that's aluminum. Aluminum always fatigues failures. Everyone should know that you never build something out of aluminum if you want it to hold up with vibration. But even the steel welds where we welded on the attachment to our steel bike frame itself were also cracking, as we noticed. So that was not a unique experience at all. And so when you're building a solar bike, you obviously need a mount for the solar panels. And bicycles don't come pre-equipped with an engineered solar panel installation. So people are having to improvise. And all the vibrations and bumps, especially when you're going in some of the countries that the Suntrip people went on, where the roads are often littered in potholes or sometimes not even paved, puts an enormous fatigue stress. And so this was the most common scenario that inflected people's rides as they were moving along. So yeah, it definitely takes a mechanical toll, and you need to build appropriately and have backup contingency plans if things fail. Some of the more obvious things, obviously solar panels work best when they're facing the sun. When you're riding the bike, you don't have a ton of control over which way the panels face. You notice that in our trike, we had it with a tilting roof. In the little video you showed us, I had to take out my Allen tools and readjust it. That became a bit of a showstopper because you couldn't really do it while you were riding. So when we were in Croatia, we stopped at a bike mechanic shop and then outfitted that with quick turn knobs so we could, without even losing a beat, change the orientation of the panels. That works great if the sun is to your left or to your right. Now, when you're traveling east to west, the sun is also going east to west. So what you want to be doing is tilting into your direction of travel or backwards. So the left and right tilting didn't have that much of an effect for us while we were riding. It was only when we were going southerly or northerly in our path where we would have an appreciable difference. Of all the trikes that entered, or the bikes in this race, I would say about 1 in 5 bothered to have tilting on their panels, and the rest just had it fixed. And for the analysis afterwards, there wasn't a whole lot of difference in those that didn't have tilting. So on this trip, with an east to west trajectory, it wasn't that significant. But when you're stopped and the sun is down on the horizon, then there's a huge opportunity to prop things up so that the panel is angled towards the sunshine. And there, this you can see, one for us, so me and Anne-Sophie are not early morning risers, and the sun, on the other hand, is an early morning riser. So the sun would rise at 6:30 in the morning. We would often sleep until 9. There's a 2.5 hour window there when you can potentially capture sometimes 600 or 700 watt hours of energy, and that's going from like a mostly empty battery to an almost fully charged battery. You're not going to get any of that unless you park your bike at night facing where the sun's going to come up in the morning. So we got very attuned to just noting where we were set up, making sure that where we parked our bike, there was a clear, unobstructed view of the sky where the sun was going to rise, and we would prop up and face that. And when we did that, we'd have the joy that we could sort of have a lazy morning, and then the sun was doing work for us. When we were ready to hop on the trike, we had a pretty much fully charged battery pack. That applies just as much when you're riding, and this is where the overlap of interest in harvesting as much solar energy and being safe are very much at odds with each other. Especially riding in a city, you've got all kinds of buildings, of overhangs, of awnings that are producing shadows on the road. And so we found ourselves very subconsciously, I mean, I guess it's conscious at first, but you start innately seeking the sun out everywhere you go because that's your fuel source. And so we would, on any road like this, we would just swerve into wherever we could do to stay in the sun. One of the behaviors of solar panels is that if you have a large solar array, so you saw when we stood it up in the video, it was 14 feet long, it's a huge panel. If even one little section of that has a bit of shade on it, the entire panel output drops dramatically. So there's one cell, whichever has the least sunlight on it, blocks the flow of electricity through all the other cells. And so even just, if we just clipped a corner of that shadow, for the whole time that corner was covering a little bit of our panel, our solar output would drop from 400 watts down to maybe 70 or 80 watts. And when you're doing that, every couple hundred meters there's another shadow, it has a huge effect on what you can actually harvest riding through the city. In high noon, this is not much of a concern, and kind of no matter where you go, you're able to have the sun, trees, telephone poles, none of that really casts a shadow across the road. But when you're earlier in the day or later in the evening and the sun is further on the horizon, there's a huge benefit to trying to stay in that path where you're not having shade obstructing you. For sure, we were eternally grateful for the toolkit that we brought. We kind of joked that we were ready for the solar apocalypse. We had, electric cordless drills. We had titanium drill bits, tap and die sets. And I wanted to be able to be self-sufficient. We had a propane-powered soldering iron, crimping tools for all the electronics, spare motor controllers, spare special high-strength rope for the pulling system. And virtually every single one of those tools came in useful at some point on the trip. That compares quite significantly to your typical toolkit, which is one multi-tool, a pump, and a patch kit. This, if you were touring in North America where you'd have much better access to replacement parts, you maybe wouldn't need that, but since we knew we were going through regions where we would have to really be on our own if something broke down, we wanted to be equipped to handle it. And then the stresses, this picture in the bottom left corner, that shows one of the other teams when we were just doing the sort of preamble riding. His system was super great and reliable until we went up the first mountain pass. And that was the first time there was that much continuous amperage flowing through his connectors that the connectors completely melted apart. And so we brought a bunch of spare connectors. I was able to stop on the side of the road, redo his connectors with a new set that could handle higher amperage, and he continued and made it all the way to China with no more connector problems. But because you're in like a DIY realm, putting these parts together, you want to have hardware on hand, and a spare electronics in the top right. That's a spare motor controller. Luckily, we had no electrical failures the entire trip. The motors, the batteries, the controllers, the bike lights all performed flawlessly. What did fail routinely was our consumer electronics. So we had a tablet that died. I went through 3 cell phones. One of them fell out of my pocket when I was just mishandling it. One fell off the trike when I hit a bump and got rolled over by the back wheel. One got damaged by water. You saw that we had a tablet with a map on it and stuff. That ended up getting completely bogged down with behavioral issues we think was from water ingress. So if your consumer electronics will suffer. But the e-bike hardware these days is actually really quite robust, and it was nice to see so few problems from the electric bike components, because a similar trip 10 or 15 years ago would definitely have been plagued with problems in motors, batteries, and controllers. So one of our involvements in the Suntrip was that not only were we participants, we also sponsored the event by creating a black box data recording device that we installed on every single electric vehicle that was competing in the Suntrip. And the idea for this, there are 2 people in the organizing committee that really wanted it. One wanted it to catch cheats. So they had suspicions that some of the other teams were plugging in and charging and had no real way to prove it, and wanted the ability to say, no, you only got 1,000 watt hours from your panel, but you used 2,000 watt hours from the battery. We know you were topping up, so you're disqualified from the race. But the other was to just gather information on what is the performance metrics of solar bike systems, so that future people planning solar bikes could make informed decisions on how big of a panel do you need, how much range could you expect to get for a given size battery and panel. And so we were also very interested in seeing that kind of data. So we produced all of these data boxes, and then in the week before the Suntrip, we went around to every single bike and installed it on their setup. So that gave us an opportunity to see what every system's solar output was, what their speed was, right down to every second, and the location where they were. So we could even correlate it with the weather at that time of the day if we have weather information from satellites. And that also let us do from both the minutia to just the big picture. On average, how many watt hours was each person getting from the sun? So this shows the solar output for our system on a typical sunny day. So we had solar panels that were 550 watts of nominal rating. And you saw how big a 550 watt panel is. That's no small amount of real estate to dedicate to bring with you on your bike. And you can see that our peak output never even hit 400 watts. And this is one of those days riding through Turkey where it was just gorgeous and sunny, and we only ever got about 80% of what the panel was rated for. But over the course of the whole day, you can see that the little blue line shows our accumulated watt hours, and we got just under 3,000 watt hours of energy. So that's 3 kilowatt hours. It's about 30 cents worth of electricity. That factor doesn't weigh into your e-bike budget very much, but in terms of what that equates to for electric bicycle range, a typical e-bike battery nowadays is about 500 watt hours. So that's like having 6 fully charged e-bike batteries just being handed to you by the sunshine as you're riding throughout the day. And having 6 fully charged e-bike batteries, that's more than enough to enable you to electric bike ride the entire day. Another great day was just the first day from the departure, when we left from Chamonix, went through Switzerland, and then wound up at the end of the day in Italy. Our goal was to do 200 kilometers a day in order to make our flight out of Tehran. And this was a case where we had to go over 2 significant mountain passes, and it was a real test of our system. And day 1 just went flawlessly. We couldn't have been more happy. You can see we make it right to the very top of the mountains just as our battery is running right on empty. As we go downhill, you can see this on the next page. This blue line here, you see our power goes negative. We're recapturing that energy on the downhill, so we're doing regenerative braking. And then you can see all of those peaks in the solar, so this purple line here is the solar power, and then every time it drops to zero, that's when there's trees and shadows in the road. And so going through the mountains in Switzerland, and there's oftentimes throughout the day when you're in shade. But we still, over the course of the day, got 2.8 kilowatt hours of electricity, and that for the bike that we were riding, you could see, even with all these hills to climb, we were still able to hit 200 kilometers. I wouldn't say effortlessly, but still giving us time to set up camp. But not every day is a sunny day. And so when you're bike touring, you're at the mercy of what your legs and your diet can do, or what your physical body can do. When you're e-bike touring, you're at the mercy of the weather and the sunshine. And it's a little bit like sailing, that you can't really predict if you're going to be stuck in still, calm waters with no wind. And the equivalent here is when it's a dark, overcast day. And at that point, you're just left with your pedal power. And the nice thing about e-bikes is that you have both the pedal and the motor. You're not dependent. If you have no motor, you can still continue to ride along. With a bike as heavy as ours, riding along meant really working hard just to maintain 10 to 12 kilometers an hour, getting quite exhausted and not having nearly as much fun. So this was actually our worst day in the entire 45 days that we were on our bike. And you can see that even in a day that was rainy throughout the day, a couple of very brief glimpses when the sun came out, we still got 1,000 watt hours from the solar panel. So the solar panels, in the absence of full sunlight, they still get all the diffuse light that's bouncing off the clouds and coming in from all different directions. And that diffuse energy, you can see in the first half where I say general clouds and drizzle, we're still getting around 100 watts. And when you have 100 watts throughout an entire day, that's 1,000 watt hours. And 1,000 watt hours is 2 fully charged e-bike batteries, which is still much better than nothing. So we're still able to get more distance, even with all the extra weight and all the air drag of the solar panels on a cloudy day, than if we had none of that and we're just pedaling under human power. The only time the panels went really to 0 watts is when we had these super dark, thunderous clouds overhead. And then it's just like the entire surroundings just got dark and gloomy, and we could just see our watts go right down to 0 for those brief times. So all that relates. So that was, the best day for us is around 3,000 watt hours. Worst days are about 1,000. What was really interesting is just what is the average? Because when you're planning a trip, you can't plan on best and worst days, but you want to get a good sense on average, what are you going to get out of the solar panels? And so these are all the different teams that we got the data boxes back from at a certain point. There's more teams too that we haven't included in the analysis. But you can see that most of them really averaged somewhere around 4 watt hours per watt. So that's kind of the magical number that you can use if you're budgeting, designing a solar bike, and you want to know how big of a panel can I get for a given range. Well, when you know how many watt hours you need or how many equivalent fully charged batteries, you just divide that number by 4 to get how many watts of a panel you need to do it. And that was a kind of a remarkably consistent number across quite a few of them. And it's something that anecdotally from previous years when people reported their own stack, self-reported, it was a similar kind of number. Now, that's how many watt hours you get. The other important side of the equation for how far you're going to go for a given amount of energy is how much watt hours do you consume per distance traveled. So this is the same as, it's the same thing as gallons per mile of a vehicle. So for each kilometer, how many watt hours of solar energy or battery energy do you use? And on this Suntrip ride, you can see that for people who are on single bikes, not tandem bikes, they were averaging about 8 watt hours per kilometer. That's less than we usually quote when we're supplying a kit to somebody, expect them to use 10 watt hours per kilometer. So on average, people are pedaling harder and using less battery power than on a typical e-biker would use, but not by too much. And on the tandem bikes, which are bigger and heavier, have more air drag, you can see that the numbers are closer to 14 watt hours per kilometer. So this is the trike that we were riding was 13.8. And that's, for a bike as big and heavy as it is, that's about what you'd expect for the consumption. So knowing watt hours per kilometer and how many watt hours you get per size of solar panel, it's then very easy to do an estimate on how far you can expect to go on average with this solar bike setup where all the electricity is coming from the sun. The data box also let us look at a lot of neat sort of peculiarities and sort of minutia optimizations. This one I found sort of interesting. So this is a case we were riding along. It's a sunny day, 350 watts. We stopped at a gas station to get some drinks to refresh ourselves, oriented the bike, the panels to be facing directly at the sun, and we had 380 watts. And we thought, great. And then we came back after getting our drinks, and I looked, and then we're down to 350 some odd watts. And what happened there? The sun was still out, there were no clouds. And what's going on is that when you stop the bike and stop moving, you lose all of the cooling effect of the air moving over the solar panels. So now these panels facing the sun heat up. When a solar panel heats up, it produces a lower voltage, so you get less energy, less power from the same solar array, and you could actually see that. And then the moment where, and this is where I didn't do it, but if we were just to spray some water on the panels and cool them down, you would see that number go up. This also makes a big difference for your, for the temperature. So the best conditions for solar bike touring are if you're in a high elevation where you get very clear skies, minimal absorption from the atmosphere, and cold temperatures. So when we were going in Switzerland to those high points, we were able to see much higher peak wattages because the panels themselves could be cooler. This is a customer of ours who was emailing us back in 2008, asking about solar systems on his bike, and I was one of those people who say, it's really not worth it, just get a bigger battery, you need so much panel. But he disregarded my advice and went ahead and built himself a solar trailer. This, I believe, is a pop trailer that lifts up and becomes a tent that he can camp in. He's in the interior of BC. Every summer he hops on this thing and goes on a ride to the coast and then up and down the coastal BC, camping as he goes. Obviously, when you're not on a solar bike race, you can charge up whenever there's outlets available, but now you have freedom from the hunt of finding charging outlets everywhere you go. You just stay parked and camping, let your batteries charge up, and we've had a surprising number of solar bike adventurers who sort of surface doing their own thing. This guy in the bottom right here, he's doing a 70,000 kilometer solar bike trip around the world. So he's going up and down every continent, southern hemisphere when it's summer there, northern hemisphere when it's summer here. He has a much smaller solar panel than what we have on our trike. But it's a trip that wouldn't have otherwise been that possible without having that extra 150 or 180 watts I think he's getting on average. And then some people, this one in the bottom left is another customer sent that to us, where he's not solar biking in that he's not charging while he's riding. That's a small fairing on a bike. It's a pretty insignificant amount of power that you'd get while you're riding, but it's enough that he can ride to work, leave his bike parked outside, and when he's ready to hop on his bike to ride home, the battery's been topped up. So I think that's about a 50 or a 70 watt panel, but you leave it in the sun for 8 hours, and that will fully charge up a flat e-bike battery. So the possibilities of combining solar with e-bikes opens up a world where you're not even grid dependent. You can actually maintain your energy supply quite independently. So it's a field that's ripe for exploration and exploitation, and we hope to encourage others to pursue the same. So if that's a field of interest to you, want to learn a little bit more, the Suntrip.com is where this main European event takes place. They have a very active website full of blogs and social media posts and articles of interest. We've made a little summary of our own Suntrip that has more detailed build videos and lists of photos and sort of descriptions of our adventure. And we'll hope to expand that and make that a bit more accessible. And otherwise, if you want more info, ask me a question. All right. So yeah.
Do you guys sell charge controllers?
So he asked, do we sell charge controllers? So in the first slide here, I talked about the components of an e-bike, and one of them is a charge controller, and a normal charger plugs into the wall. A solar charge controller plugs into a solar panel. And yes, we do carry one version. The one here, Jennison, is sort of the premium brand made in America, but it's not programmable. So you can only get it for one specific voltage of battery pack. We get an imported unit where you can set it to any voltage so that as your battery needs change, you can use the same charge controller for it. But yeah, we started carrying these last year for these budding solar explorers. Anybody else? Oh, BC Ferries is enormously generous in this regards of treating anything with pedals as a bicycle. That's been my experience. We've had customers build the wildest contraptions that still just pay you a $2 bicycle fee to get on the ferry. So at least at this juncture, you don't have to worry too much about being charged vehicle expenses. Yeah. Anybody? Yeah. So that was a good question. So yes, what are the issues bringing a bike on a plane with batteries? And that's a huge issue. A lithium battery is considered dangerous goods, and so it's not allowed on passenger aircraft. And even to ship a lithium battery with a shipping company, it has to be classified on a special dangerous goods cargo plane. And that puts it out of reach for anybody to travel with a normal e-bike battery. So you saw so the battery here, you couldn't travel with that. You couldn't bring it on a plane. In our build, you saw that we had a bunch of small batteries stacked together. So each one of those batteries is just under the energy limit that you can bring as a carry-on baggage. So we were able to bring our batteries with us on the plane. We, up until this point, had zero issues flying with these batteries. You bring them in your carry-on baggage, it goes through security, they take it out, they look to see that it's less than 100 watt hours, they give it back to you. And so we expected to have no issues coming back with our trike, but leaving the airport in Tehran, the Iranian authorities had a very different idea about what you should do with lithium batteries on an airplane. And so we were flying with British Airways. The pilot for the British Airways was right there. He said, no, these have to be in your carry-on baggage, that's the rule. And then the Iranian authorities were saying, no, this has to go in your checked baggage. You're not allowed lithium in the carry-on. There's a bunch of back and forth. I showed them the webpage of the IATA transport rules, and I was able to bring the batteries I was carrying with me out of Iran. My wife, now wife, Anne Sophie, was in a different ladies' security checkout and wasn't able to negotiate to have her batteries. So that's the only time we've seen the batteries actually confiscated at an airport. But otherwise, if you're less than 100 watt hours, it's usually no problem to fly with the pack. Excess baggage charges. So we left the trike in Iran. So we just flew back with our own stuff, and then we arranged a freight shipping company to bring the trike itself back. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to, that would be excessive. And it was, I mean, just the cost to get that trike shipped back here was, I think, $3,500. It was it didn't make financial sense, but we kind of wanted to keep it for this kind of legacy piece that it is. And we want to go touring around BC. And you saw we've got a little child now. We want to put her in between the two seats so that our daughter can be on a 360-degree turret seat right in between both of us, and then go on little family solar biking trips up and down the coast. Yeah. Do you run into what? Oh, he asked if you run into legal issues bringing an e-bike into other countries. It's true that Europe has much more stringent requirements for what is an electric bicycle in terms of the power and the speed capabilities. Every bike on this Suntrip race was well in excess of that. They were all well over 250 watts. They all provided electric assist well above 24 kilometers an hour. And nobody in any of the European countries gave a rat's ass about that. There's a lot of people have concerns about these rules and regulations. I think the European legislators are wise to the fact that it's better to encourage these alternate modes than to clamp down and cause unnecessary bureaucracy and enforcement. It would make very little sense to have a system of this size and complexity that only had a 250 watt motor on it. And as far as the speed limits went, we were never asked at any borders. When we got into the border between Turkey and Iran, they were asking where our license plate was because they thought it was a car. And then we said, no, it's a bicycle. And then they chuckled and said, okay, and off we went. But it never came up at any border crossings. Oh, does this meet these various EN 1519 whatever guidelines? Didn't come up at all, and I'm grateful for that because I would be sad if that was the main concern for European policymakers. Is that it? Yeah.
Is the battery technology changing frequently?
Yeah. So the question was, is the battery technology changing frequently? I would say batteries haven't plateaued, but they've reached a point where they're very maxed out in what the theoretical energy density could be, and the performance is getting incrementally better, but the standards of a battery now is perfect. And so the idea that we need to hold out for this new battery breakthrough before electric vehicles or electric bikes are feasible holds no water at all. If you were to give me the specs of today's battery 15 years ago when I was first starting off building e-bikes, my jaw would have dropped to the floor. Like, what? You can get 250 watt hours per kilo. You can charge these things at 20-minute charge times, and the cost on them is way lower than when we were first in this field too. So the battery, even if batteries don't improve one bit, they're not at all the weak point in the electric vehicle system. I'd say they're one of the most robust and reliable parts of e-bikes, and we can keep looking forwards to 3%, 5% improvements year after year, but we're not going to see some step upgrade like the step from nickel metal hydride to lithium was huge, and then lithium's now doubled compared to what it was when it first became widespread on the market. We're not going to see another doubling, and that's not an issue because that's not limiting the capabilities of these vehicles. So then he asked, what about the technology for solar panels? So solar panels have similarly made a huge improvement in the last 10 years. So it used to be that a typical solar panel was 14 to 15% efficiency. Now the solar panels that you see here are running 22% for not a premium panel. That is just like at the upper end of a mid-range panel. And the premium panels are now at about 27%. Which is mind-boggling compared to those who were doing solar in the 80s or in the first oil crisis in the 70s, where your solar array might be 10% efficient. This trip would have not been possible with 10% efficient panels, right? So right now, the solar, in my opinion, is at a point where it's just feasible to do solar e-bike traveling. And if they were half this efficient, you wouldn't consider it. Like, we couldn't have done it if we only got half that much energy each day. It wouldn't have been worth it. I hope solar panels improve because there's room for that to get 30, 35, 40%. And I know that at the cutting edge of stuff that's been done in the at leading edge research institutes, I've seen things as much as 40%, but I have no idea where that's needing to get to for commercialization. But at 22% now is pretty great, and you can even buy 27% if you're willing to pay an extra 2 to 3 times the amount. So, but yeah, I can't read in the future of commercialization there, but it's exciting that the potential's there. All right, I think I only have 2 minutes left. If there's any last question. Yes. Yeah.
Do they also rate as a wattage maximum?
In fact, yeah. Yeah. So the question was, with regard to the Suntrip rules, I mentioned there's a maximum wattage and maximum size, and how is that rated? And every panel has a nominal rating, and there's a standardized way that solar panels are rated, where there's a certain amount of light flux in a certain area, and any panel that says a wattage should be, by that same standard, classified the same way. One thing that you'll notice, so we had a 550 watt panel, but you saw that on that sunny day, the most we got was 400 watts. And that's pretty typical that in real world conditions, that 500 watts, 50 watts, is if the sun was straight ahead on a day with no particulates, no haze in the atmosphere. What's very interesting is that you'll often exceed your maximum wattage in certain situations, and that's when you have the sun shining through, but you have clouds surrounding the sun. So we had one day in Italy where it was cloudy, rainy, we were kind of cursing, and then the sun came out and we looked at our display and we were getting 600 watts of sunlight because we have the light coming right through the sky and all the light that reflects off the clouds. But on average, bank for on a sunny day getting 80% of what the rated watts is. Any other questions?
How do you guys carry all the tools and where do you sleep?
The question was, how did we carry all the tools and where did we sleep at night? So we had I think I have a folder here. So this is all the gear that we managed to stuff on our trike. And so we designed it so that we had luggage storage under our seats, in between the 2 seats. And this includes sleeping bags, foamies. So we would camp most nights. Occasionally we would stay in at an accommodation when we needed to shower. And yeah, so you obviously, when you're bike touring, you need to design to carry lots of things. And we designed this trike frame with various storage levels in between and under the seats.
Cost of your build?
The question was the final cost of our build. We're a business that designs and makes the parts, so all the parts on the bike we built and fabricated ourselves. But if you were to purchase those things, and we bought the trike frame used on Craigslist, but if you were to purchase all that stuff new, that's at least $10,000 in components. I mean, just $3,000 for a tandem trike. the two motors, the controllers, all of the electronics, and the batteries would be another $3,000. The solar panels were over $1,000. So yeah, not a cheap pursuit at all. Yeah, that's the answer to that. Super good question. So you noticed the Super Soaker water gun. So you saw in the video as we were riding through, actually we were in Serbia when we had that very friendly dog running us. Not all dogs are friendly when you're bike touring, and a lot of people will know that their main curse of any touring trip is dogs chasing after their heels, not leaving them alone. My partner Anne-Sophie is not particularly fond of aggressive dogs, and so we planned, because we had a 360-degree view, we figured that we were well armed to carry a water gun filled with vinegar, so that if any dog got particularly annoying. There was only one situation where we actually had a pack of 5 dogs that were really howling, and we were in our scramble to take it out. Is that when you soaked me? Anyways, the one time we came to use it, we mispulled the trigger, and Anne-Sophie just drenched me in the front of the trike. But we kept it on defense should that have come up as a concern. But most of the dogs were pretty friendly. Yes?
You talked about the wear on bad roads.
Yeah.
Maybe like on better roads.
So that was a great question. So I discussed at some length the stress that was put on all the components. That's almost entirely because of the fact that we were riding over some incredibly unfriendly roads. And so all of those stress cracks, in fact, the main one on our frame, we felt we tipped the trike 3 times in total. You saw one of them in the video. It happened twice near the end of our trip when we were kind of getting on the curb, and then the wheel propped up too much and we flipped over. But if you were riding on smooth ground, I wouldn't expect any of those kind of fatigue cracks. For the rest of the teams, when they went through Kazakhstan, there were some stretches of road that were just horrendous with potholes everywhere. It actually brings up a really interesting point. So the tricycles fared by far the worst when it came to fatigue. And a big part of that is when you're riding on a trike, you have 3 wheels, and with 3 wheels, you can never avoid every pothole. So on 2 wheels, you can weave your way between the obstacles, but that's not an option when the wheels straddle like this. So bicycles, 2-wheeled bicycles, and those with trailers with inline wheels had a much easier job avoiding these constant bumps. And the trikes really suffered. And if we were to do those roads again, for sure we'd look at doing a suspended trike frame rather than rigid. At one point we switched to much larger tires, which made a big difference. But yeah, on normal highway roads, I wouldn't be too worried. Yeah.
It sounds like you had mostly mechanical problems for this trip. Were there any problems with the motor?
Super good question. Yeah. So his question was, it sounded like we had a bunch of mechanical problems. How did the electrics hold up? Did we have any problems with our motors, our batteries, our motor controllers? And the surprising answer is no. And it was for us, it was a bit of a test of gear because we made our own motors, we made our own controllers, we made our own batteries. And we wanted to use this trip as a bit of a proving ground. We had backup motor controllers and backup electronics in case that was to happen. But for us, every issue that we ran into, and I haven't gone into all the other mechanical things that failed on the way, but they were all mechanical. Some other teams had electrical problems. There's one team had their battery catch fire. We had one team have intermittent problems with motor controllers, but mechanical tended to dominate it, the set of problems.
When you describe the motor overheating, how hot did it get some of the days you were out? And when did you have
Yeah. So in the video, there's a point where we stopped to let the motors cool down, and the question is, how hot did the motors get? Because we had 2 motors on our bike that were in small diameter wheels, which helps them generate good hill climbing torque, our motors never got above 100, 110 degrees Celsius. And that's well below the point where you burn up a motor, which would be about 150 to 180. But whenever you're going touring like this, it's always on long, steady climbs where you start pushing the thermal limits. When you saw those melted connectors, that was going up a long, steady climb where the connectors get hotter and hotter, and if the climb never ends, it just gets to the point where something fails. But we always advise having a system where there's a temperature sensor inside the motor, and then you don't have any worry because you can automatically scale the power back before you burn something up. But if we were to do this trip with one, in fact, before we had the 2 motors on the front, we were testing it out with one motor on the back, and it would overheat all the time. We did a trip to the Sunshine Coast and back, and we were stressing the limits of that motor regularly. So you do need to choose from the get-go something appropriate for the weight of vehicle that you have. So his question, were we on the throttle or was it pedal assist? I can't even remember. I think we're mostly pedal assist, but we had it so we could adjust the amount of watts, but we could also adjust our speed limit. And one of the ways that we often rode is we would set a speed limit on the system, and then the power would vary automatically up and down depending if we're going uphill or downhill. And then we weren't constantly adjusting. And then if we found, we're going through our battery too fast and the sun doesn't look too good, we would just reduce our speed limit. So on good sunny weather, we'd set the limit at 30, 32, 34 kilometers an hour. And then it was cloudy, we'd drop that to 20 or 22. And then we'd ride at a constant speed and the power would automatically increase or decrease, but with a pedal sensor, but not responding to how hard we're pedaling, just trying to maintain a fixed speed. A throttle gets tedious to hold for that long of a trip, but we did have a throttle for when it was necessary.
Did you have stator-rated motors?
Great questions. So that was 2 questions. One is, did we consider tubeless tires? So you saw in the video us fixing a flat. We actually had a spade of flats, one after another, at one point, which we traced down to a cracked sidewall that was rubbing against our inner tube. He asked, had we considered tubeless tires? I've never done tubeless before, so for me that would be an uncomfortable territory. I'm pretty sure we would have had fewer tire issues with properly done tubeless, but we also switched out our tires. We went through 3 different sets of tires over the trip because they wore down. We had to have tires shipped to us when we got to Turkey because our primary set were so worn down they were almost bald. And doing tire replacements is much harder when you're tubeless. So if you go tubeless, you have to make sure you're equipped to deal with tire replacements when they come up, and that's not as easy. And then the other question is, did we have statorate in the motors? Statorate is a ferrofluid that we can add to motors to help them run much cooler. And the answer is we didn't, because we had issues where it was leaking through the ball bearings with this particular motor model, and we didn't want to risk our ball bearings getting damaged. So for us, having reliable bearings is more important. We could always stop and allow the motor to cool, but we couldn't stop and replace a ball bearing that had the grease come out of it. Now the motor's been redesigned so that that's not a concern, but for this ride we didn't have the ferrofluid cooling solutions. But on future trips I definitely encourage it. So I hope that with this talk some of you might be inspired or might be able to inspire somebody to consider joining the fun in one of the future Suntrip races. We have a fantasy here of organizing a North American Suntrip. I'm not sure when or if that would happen, but if we do, we'd love to leave from Vancouver and travel to Florida with a similar theme of solar bikes that people build and ride themselves with no real rules other than leave from here, arrive there, get all your energy from the sun. But the Suntrip in Europe continues to be an annual event, and usually every other year they do a big distance. So 2020 is supposed to be another very long 10,000 plus kilometer tour. The following years they usually do about a 2,000 kilometer circle inside Europe, so just staying within France, Germany, Italy, etc., which is much more accessible for people that don't want to go to the full distances. All right, anyways, thank you all for the questions, and if you have further questions, we have a booth. It's that way, booth B207. The company is Grin Technologies, so if you look for that sign, I'll be in and out of that booth, but if you have more solar e-bike specific questions, feel free to find me there, and I'll be happy to help. Thanks now.